Okay, so we had left off with our first set of notes talking about what had gone on in Europe and whether or not the United States should do anything to help the Allies and to stop Hitler. Now in the second set of notes, we're going to cover decisions 2 and 3 that you'll be doing, and we're focused on the other side of the world to start off here, and that is in Japan. Japan, and this is a map of the Pacific. Japan is this set of islands here off the coast of China. We had talked about how Japan, by the 1930s and even before that, had been trying to expand their influence in the Pacific. They had invaded China, as we'll see on a map next, but they were trying to create this buffer zone, basically an area outside of the mainland of Japan to give them protection and to increase their influence. And so the United States, we respond to this. Not militarily, we tried to make it as peaceful as possible, but we respond politically and economically to try to do anything we can to have Japan stop their aggressive action. And so economically, we did a couple things. We ended the sale of scrap metal to Japan, and the biggest thing is we put an embargo on oil, basically meaning we did not sell oil to Japan anymore, and we'll see why that's so important in a second. And so this is just a map of the influence that Japan was expanding in the Pacific, going all the way back to the late 1800s, but specifically up into the 1920s and 1930s. We had already talked about how they took over Manchuria, this area here in China, and you can see how large of an influence Japan really did have in the Pacific by the time we get into the late 1930s, mid to late 1930s. And so this issue with oil, an embargo on oil, why it was so important. This shows us in 1935, the United States was the largest exporter of oil, and Japan was the 6th largest importer of oil. On top of this, Japan, as this shows us, by 1940, was getting 80% of their oil from the United States. So the reason this is so important is when we shut off the oil to Japan, that devastates their economy, and it puts them in such a desperate situation. And so when people are put in a desperate situation, they take desperate action, which of course leads us to the big event in the Pacific, and that is the surprise attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor on the American fleet that was stationed there, our Pacific fleet. This was on Sunday, December 7th, the morning of December 7th, 1941, and it was a surprise attack. We did not see it coming. It was an attack on military personnel at the base, but most of the U.S. fleet is destroyed, and we'll cover this more in class, but this leads us to our second decision, and that is, after Pearl Harbor, what do we do? And so the specific question is, what action should the United States take in response to Pearl Harbor? And so once again, whatever decision you think we should do or make, consider the costs and benefits of that decision. Moving into our second decision, we're going back to Europe, and when we had left there, we had seen Hitler basically controlling almost all of Europe, Great Britain being the last real hope for the Allies, and they're able to hold off Hitler's advance through the Battle of Britain, through the bombings that take place there. And now Hitler turns his attention to the east. If you remember, he had made a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union to the east. And this was kind of part of all of his master plan, you could say, that he wanted time to take over Europe, but eventually he knew that he wanted to take over the Soviet Union. And he was, in a way, obsessed with it, and he wanted to dominate the Soviet Union. And so when he has the option to invade, even though his advisors told him differently, he takes Russia head on. And as we'll see later on, a place called Stalingrad, which of course is named after the leader of the Soviet Union. And he could have gone many different ways to invade the Soviet Union, but he takes Soviet Union head on, and really, in the end, because of that, will be his doom. And so this is Stalingrad, that is, becomes the bloodiest battle of the war. One of the quotes that the Russians used was "not one step back," that this was going to be the place where we finally stop Hitler's advance. And really, we'll talk later about D-Day, but a lot of historians point to Stalingrad as the true turning point of the war. As we'll see, it's at this point that Hitler is stopped, and is actually the Russians start pushing back the Germans back west towards Germany. And there, I put a quote on there: "Don't invade Russia in the winter," which is a sort of historical quote because nobody has ever successfully conducted a land invasion of Russia, especially in the winter. And Hitler's plan was to do it quickly, but he gets bogged down. And by the winter of 1942, which was brutal, his army doesn't know how to handle it, whereas the Russians do. And so they have the advantage. It's very brutal warfare, but the Russians, through the course of 1942-43, do hold off the German advance and actually begin to push back. This is going to be just a short clip about the Battle of Stalingrad.
An estimated 1,530,000 people killed or wounded. These are the astonishing figures from the Battle of Stalingrad, often regarded as the bloodiest in history. The World War II battle between the German Axis forces and Soviet Russia over the city now known as Volgograd lasted from the 21st of August 1942 to the 2nd of February 1943, making it 199 days, the largest single battle in history. The siege of Stalingrad was part of Fall Blau, part of Hitler's grand plan to secure the Eastern Front. Like Operation Barbarossa, it was doomed to failure, and is considered to have been a major turning point in the Second World War. Strategically and symbolically, Stalingrad was an important target for Hitler, who ignored advice from his generals in order to attack the city named after his great foe, Joseph Stalin. The battle began with heavy bombing by the German Luftwaffe, before ground forces moved into the city, at one point securing up to 90% of it. The fighting was long, arduous, and with no regard for civilian life. Captured areas changed hands over and over again, and snipers reigned supreme in the shelled-out buildings. As winter approached, the Russians benefited. The frozen Volga River made it easier for them to get supplies through, while the Germans found themselves cut off, starving, and eventually simply freezing to death. The turnaround came on the 19th of November 1942, when the Russians put Operation Uranus into action. Its main objective was to push through the weaker outlying Axis flanks, which mostly consisted of outnumbered and poorly equipped Romanian infantry. The next day, Soviet forces moved west in a pincer movement, meeting 2 days later near Kalak and sealing a ring around Stalingrad. The Russians wanted to film this decisive moment for propaganda, but had no cameras available and had to restage the events later. The Germans retaliated with Operation Wintergewitter, but as the severe Russian winter set in, the German forces were soon dying in their thousands. By the new year, the Germans could hold out no longer, and on the 31st of January, Friedrich Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces, just a day after being promoted to General Feldmarschall by Adolf Hitler.
So, as the Russians are starting to push the Germans back on the Eastern Front, the United States, after Pearl Harbor, is now involved in World War II. The day after Pearl Harbor, December 8th, we declare war on Japan and also get involved in the European campaign. So the first place that we enter, we do not take a head-on attack of Europe quite yet. We attack in Africa along with the British, this allied force. And so we open up a second front on top of what the Russians were doing on the Eastern Front. And the idea here was to force Hitler to divert his forces away from the Russians on the Eastern Front, and this was known as Operation Torch. This was led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who will become even more famous, obviously, by the end of the war. And so, almost the same time that the Battle of Stalingrad is going on, the United States and the British land in Africa, North Africa. And who they find there is the German commander, a guy named Erwin Rommel, who famously becomes known as the Desert Fox because of his strategies that he used against the Allies. Eventually, as we'll see in maps later, he is defeated by the Allies, but mostly not anything against him. It was mostly because Hitler just didn't supply him with the tanks that he needed, which was the whole point of the Allies' strategy to begin with. And so this is a map here. You can see some of the places that the Allies land here in North Africa to start pushing east against Erwin Rommel and the Axis powers in North Africa. And so they are able to do that relatively quickly through 1942 and into 1943. And so the next place that they look is actually into the mainland of Europe. And so if you look at these peninsulas here, they're actually going to enter Europe. The first place is the invasion of Italy. And this was an amphibious invasion. That means from land onto water, as well as using paratroopers from the sky, are the first place that the United States and the Allies enter Europe. And so this is where we're at by about 1943. The Axis powers have been taken out of North Africa. The Russians are starting to push back on the Eastern Front, and now becomes the big decision. And that is, we need hopefully one last big invasion of Europe. And where is this going to take place? The United States, we wanted to do it in France. The British and Winston Churchill, they wanted to do it and stage it from Italy. They called it the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. So your question is, France, Italy, or any other place? You could attack any point around the coast or the borders of the Axis powers. What would be the most effective place to attack the Axis powers of Europe at this particular time? So this is your question. Where to invade Europe? France, Italy, or other? And once again, consider the costs and benefits of your decision.